Hi, welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter, and I'll be your host for today's show. I'm so glad you guys are able to join us for our first show of the year. This is a time for you to hear some good news about all that your partnership with State Policy Network is making possible. And I don't know about you, but I think we could all use just a little bit of good news right about now. I've talked to many of you over the course of the last few weeks, and I know many of you have also talked with Tracy and my colleagues at SPN. And I've got to tell you, I have never, ever heard you guys have so much deep concern for where our country is right now in this moment and what the future looks like. Now, at the same time, you guys also have an awful lot of optimism brewing inside of you, and you guys have a fighting spirit that is unparalleled. It's been really amazing talking with each and every one of you, and it is in that spirit of optimism that I invited Yuval Levine to join our show today. Yuval is a chair at the American Enterprise Institute, and he is one of our generation's greatest thought leaders. He also recently wrote a book called A Time to Build. So in a few minutes, we're going to hear from Yuval and find out why he thinks we have reason to be optimistic and learn a little bit more about his book. But first, let's welcome Tracy Sharp to the show. Tracy is the leader of State Policy Network, and she's coming to us from California. Tracy, welcome to the show. How have you been?
I've been great. Thanks, Rebecca. It's great to see you. And it's great to be back with this, our loyal audience, our first America at its Best episode for 2021. And it's been a year so far, and it's only been a month.
It has been a year so far. How have you processed this post-election 2021 world?
Well, I think it's helped quite a bit to be able to talk to several of our supporters and key leaders out in the network, and to be able just really to process what happened. I mean, January brought a lot of heartache, both in the terrible rioting and violence at our Capitol, and in much of our opposition gaining control of the White House and Senate. Understandably, the flurry of executive orders from Washington indicate that they're going to keep trying to grow government under this new administration, and that's a threat to our liberty and prosperity. But as you said, it is a time for optimism as well, because it gives me hope that despite what Washington does, that imperial city on the Potomac, we still have a federalist system or a system of states with a certain degree of their own powers, their own constitutional muscle to push back on DC. And the founders knew that this day would arrive, and therefore enabled individual states and citizens to have a say, more of a say in how they're governed, and therefore the ability to balance power. And so we're going to get to hear from Yuval today, but also to make note that the 2020 election did have gains for the states. And despite being vastly outspent in the campaigns, there are still 20 red triplexes and 23 trifectas. So more to say about that and what we can look forward to in the weeks and months ahead.
Okay, Tracy, thanks. And with that, let's bring on Yuval and see what he has to say about what happened in this state elections and also where we go from here. Welcome to the show, Yuval.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really great. And I have to say, we who work in the policy world are so grateful for SPN and all the enormously important work that you do. It's really a thrill for me to be with you.
Oh, well, we're thrilled to have you with us. And I want to back up before we get into what's happening right in this moment and how we move forward. I want to talk a little bit about the book that you wrote. And I think this was actually published before March of 2020. So this is pre-pandemic, pre-everything else.
On another planet, yeah.
Yes, it's called A Time to Build. Tell us about the book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the book was published in January of 2020. So it does seem like it might have been a million years ago, but it's really an attempt to understand the kind of social crisis that our country is living through, the sense that so many people have of frustration and aggravation, not only with politics, but with a culture that too often is failing us, with a sense that Americans are living apart from each other and in ways that are hostile to each other. The question the book really asks is, how have we gotten here and what can we do? And it focuses especially on the health of our institutions, on this kind of cliche that everybody knows that Americans have lost trust in institutions. the book tries to interrogate that a little bit. What does it really mean to have trust in institutions? And what does that have to do with that larger crisis we're living through that we can see as polarization, that we can see as culture war, that we can see as alienation, and even as a sense of despair in people's personal lives that's led so many Americans toward whether it's drug addiction or rising suicide rates, all these trends that we've seen in American life over the course of this century so far are connected somehow. And the book tries to think about what that connection might involve.
And so are you proposing then that we rebuild these institutions?
I think that there's a need for us to recognize the important role that institutions play in our lives. Institutions are the forms of what we do together, right? They're the ways that people join together in the service of common aspirations. And so much of what's gone wrong in American life is a failure to do that, a failure to see ourselves as connected with other people who share our goals and aspirations, and a failure to act on those kinds of connections. And that does mean reaffirming institutions. We're living in a time when we incline to want to burn things down, and there are a lot of things that are begging to be burned down, don't get me wrong. But we have to understand that ultimately we need to be building, that if we want to think about how do we make the future better, we have to ask ourselves, what do we build that we don't now have? What do we rebuild that needs to work better? Those are the kinds of questions, constructive questions, that can get us somewhere. And the book tries in some practical ways, looking at politics, the academy, the media, religious life, to think about what it would mean to try to be builders in these different areas of American life.
And how would you position something like that to the people in our country and across the rest of the world who feel that so many institutions have let them down and have?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that sense of being let down is why we need to think as builders, right? It's a sense that can lead us to aggravation, that can lead us to want to tear things down, or to want to, all the images of burning down and draining swamps and all the rest of it. It's entirely understandable. But ultimately, if you do that, then you're left with nothing. The question is, what do we build? What do we build and rebuild so that our society can work again? We're not just trying to fight an enemy. We're not just trying to purge something. We're trying to strengthen our society. And that means thinking in institutional terms about how we can work together with people who share our vision of the good and make this work. So I think those people who are moved to go into the streets and protest, left or right, America or elsewhere, what they're saying is that our systems have failed them. What that means is that we need to rebuild those systems in ways that are worthy of our trust. And that is really the project of the coming decades.
And if you had written this book in January of this year versus last year, would anything have changed, or is your philosophy just even stronger now than it was then?
I think in some ways we've seen the argument of the book proven in a couple of ways. This has been a year in a sense of failing institutions, but it's also been a year of a lot of Americans rising to challenges from the bottom up, not standing around with arms folded, waiting for some official to show up, but thinking about what to do in their own children's school, what to do in their own community, what to do to help people in need, whether that's around the pandemic, whether that's with the kinds of violence we've seen in the streets in some parts of our country. It's been a very challenging year, but I think it's been a year that, if anything, has highlighted the need to strengthen and focus on our institutions. Again, from the political to the social and cultural, all the way to our families and communities.
Mm-hmm. Let's shift gears for a second. When you think about institutions, some people think about the federal government as an institution. And do you think that people rely too much on the federal government to solve problems?
I do. I mean, I think there is an inclination now to think of public problems as national problems and therefore as federal problems. There's also an inclination to treat our national politics as a form of entertainment, as just something we stand around and watch, rather than as part of our system of governing ourselves that's connected to its other parts. And so I think as our governing institutions at the federal level, like so many other institutions, like universities, like the media, have become, in a sense, platforms for people to perform on, to put on a political show, it's become harder to think of our larger system of government as the way in which we solve problems. And we just tend to want to see what happens next in Washington. But the fact is, when we confront problems, it makes much more sense to start where we are and to think about, how do we address this here among people who I know, maybe we're in different parties, but we're both looking at the same problem on the street. That happens much more at the local level and even at the state level in American life than it can happen right now at the national level. The way I think about it is, if you want to be an optimist about America, You can't do that by looking at the country from the top down. You look at it from the top down right now, and you're not optimistic. I'm not. But if you look at our country from the bottom up, what you find are a lot of people working together to solve problems. And that's the right way to look at America at any time.
Mhm.
Yeah, you mentioned that the pandemic put this to the test. And we did see a lot of America's problem-solving power at the local level, whether that was making masks or trying to take care of the elderly or really serve during this pandemic, which has been a very disorienting time for so many Americans. But from the bottom up, it's more practical. Americans are so pragmatic to be able to solve and address these issues.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We've seen a couple of the traditional arguments for federalism proven over the course of this year. One is that federalism enables experimentation, and we've certainly seen that. Different states have taken different paths. Some have succeeded and some have failed. There are patterns to these. We can learn from them what can work. And states clearly do learn from one another. I mean, I think you could see New York State learning from Florida about how to deal with nursing homes in the course of the spring and summer. And they reversed course and improved things because a different state, they're never going to admit this, but they saw what happened there and they saw what happened in New York and they learned a lesson. I think a lot of states have been thinking that way about what they're doing. It's what you do when you don't know what to do is you experiment. And our system allows for that to happen in different states. But we've also seen that government is just simply more answerable to the public when it is closer to the ground. And different parts of our country actually want different things in response to this pandemic. It's not just that we're experimenting to find the one best way to solve a problem. There isn't going to be one. And people think differently about how to prioritize. People think differently about schooling. People think differently about public health in different parts of our society. And the American answer to that has always been, okay, good, let's live that way. Let's make sure that people's communities and their states allow them to live in the way that they've chosen. And I think that's not just a way to experiment with national solutions. It's also an alternative to thinking purely nationally about solutions.
Mhm. You seem a lot more optimistic than any other pundit that I've seen in interviews and on TV. Is there more reason for, I mean, I understand that you think local is better, but with so much bad stuff coming out of DC, how are you marrying
Yeah.
reality versus wishful thinking?
Let me say a word about optimism. I think in terms of hopefulness more than optimism, right? Optimism is just expecting good things to happen. I'm a conservative. I don't expect good things to happen. But I'm hopeful. And hopefulness is not expecting good things to happen, but believing that if we work at it, good things can happen. Optimism can make you passive. Hopefulness makes you active. And there are a lot of reasons for hope in America now. It's mostly because I do try to look at the country from the bottom up and to think about where solutions are happening and what we can learn from them. Obviously, I'm not feeling great about what's happening in Washington. I mean, look, I think we're in for a number of years here of a federal government that's moving things in the wrong direction. But the Democrats have very narrow majorities in the Senate, not even a real majority at all. And ultimately, they're in a pretty weak position. I think there is room for Republicans to push back, to stop, to slow, to make a difference, even to get some things done, possibly. But more importantly, there's room for the states to lead. There's room for the states to push ahead, both in responding to the pandemic and public health challenges, but also in the more traditional policy arenas, in health and education, welfare. There is room for this period to be a time of state and local experimentation that prepares us for the next phase of American government, where we can hope also for better governing in Washington. So I'm not, to say I'm optimistic, I think wouldn't be quite right, but I am hopeful. And I think it's just crazy not to be hopeful about America. This country rises up out of its challenges. We're in a moment of challenge, but that means that this is a time when we're going to figure out our next way forward.
So you mentioned if we work at it, good things will come. Let's talk specifically about some issues that I know are on our viewers' minds. Some of you guys sent in questions ahead of time about this. If you have additional questions, reminder, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, or excuse me, the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. But Tracy and Yuval, I wanted to talk about a few specific issues and how we think that the states can move these forward. So first question is around election integrity. My personal biggest fear is that the federal government is going to decide to fix this for all of us, and I think that would be a disaster.
Yeah.
One of our viewers, Dick Weiss, sent in a question asking if local representatives are finding voter integrity too toxic to touch, because it is loaded right now. So Yuval, let's start with you, and then Tracy will hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, it's a loaded issue. And I would say this is a dangerous moment in a number of ways, but I think it's particularly dangerous because it creates a situation where the issue feels so loaded that we run the risk of not doing anything about it. And the fact is, election integrity is a real concern. That doesn't mean that the last election was illegitimate, but precisely out of a fear of seeming to be saying that, a lot of people at the state level run the risk of not doing anything about election integrity. And there is a lot to be done. There are lessons we've learned from the last election. There are lessons we've known for years. And I think that this is a time when it makes sense to think concretely about what some of these lessons may be, what we can learn from what we've seen in 2020, from what we've known for a long time. It may not necessarily mean going back to a situation where most states don't have much mail-in voting, for example. Maybe there are ways to make that work, but we've got to take that challenge seriously and think about it not in terms of which party does it benefit, but how do we help our democracy function? And there are risks from all directions. There are risks of being called racist because you want to take up the question of election integrity. A lot of state policymakers face that fear. But ultimately, this isn't about race and it isn't about party. It's about A, allowing people to vote who are eligible to vote, and B, securing our system from threats. Look, after the 2016 election, it was Democrats who were arguing about the need for focusing on election integrity. Now it's Republicans. They're both right. There is a need to focus on election integrity. And it's an area where states have to lead, because if there's one thing this last election taught us, it's that we don't want a single national election system. Just think about the mess we would have had if this were one system. We would still be counting votes now. We're well served by the fact that we have 50 separate state election systems, that they're run by people who understand the conditions on the ground and the priorities of the public. That has got to be retained and preserved. But the way to do that is to take election integrity seriously and for states to work together to build up some models of how to do this right.
Tracy, anything to add?
Those are excellent points. And really, it is an opportunity for the legislative advocacy arm of this network to really engage with state legislatures, both Democrats and Republican. It is a bipartisan issue. But I want to, if I can, take a moment just to talk about the need to really reinvigorate our state legislatures to step up to this and to help them with really thoughtful reforms to build in more accountability, transparency, and reliability into our election process, our vote counting systems, and to look forward. This effort to help our state legislatures step up to their responsibilities, and in some cases, help them not shirk in a lot of cases, help them not shirk their responsibilities. This is really an essential path to helping us rebuild institutions as well. If I could, I want to read a quote from one of our board members, John Hood, published a column on Monday talking about this very issue, about state legislatures needing to step up. And I think we can put the link in the chat box. But here's just a snippet of what he said. He said, quote, "Why does a weak legislative branch produce toxic, unproductive politics? Because representative bodies are the best places to hash out solutions to complicated problems. Crafting and passing bills is a messy process. That's a feature, not a bug. It's a process that subjects competing views to intense scrutiny, and it requires some give and take to get a final version that can pass both chambers," unquote. I thought that was a great way to summarize the need, how the founders knew that this kind of hashing out of issues at the state and local level produces a more relevant and responsive result to serve the people in their states. And as you've always saying, every state is different, but every state has the responsibility to set up a reliable election process, one that has integrity. And that's why we see a lot of our state groups engaging on this very thoughtfully to help those legislators do that.
Let me say a word about that. I think it's an enormously important point that John Hood makes, and it's true at the national level too. American government is legislative government. It's built on the understanding that we resolve problems in a diverse body that represents the differences among our people. And that's very true at the state level too. It is a mistake to think of state government as governor government. It is fundamentally about legislative action, and especially these difficult issues, genuinely controversial issues, can only be resolved in a durable and legitimate way by legislators. That's just how our system works and how it works well for us.
Yeah, and lest we forget that, and we did a whole episode on this, is that state legislatures hold the executive accountable, at least they're supposed to, in terms of using these emergency powers,
Yeah.
which can become tyrannical during times of panic. So beefing those up as well, that there's some judicial and legislative oversight over governors. It works at the federal level as well, we would hope.
Yep.
Yes, great points. Let's move on to education. There are a lot of people fired up about this right now, not just the donor community, but parents and business owners who want their employees to come back to work and not just be home trying to get their kids on virtual school. Tracy, is Joe Biden going to fix my son's school and make sure he's got what he needs to get back to school? How's that going to work?
Ask any parent with a child, at a school-age child at home, they're losing their mind. We need to get these decisions out of the hands of the bureaucrats and back into the hands of parents, where we give them more choice and options to where they want to send their children. And I think one thing we talk about, the problem-solving power, the ingenuity of Americans, was one idea that's come out of the pandemic are these pods, these education pods, where parents can choose to put their child in small groups. And it's one more arrow in the quiver of options that we can help parents with, whether it's choice vouchers, ESAs, charters, very important, and also these educational pods, in addition to homeschooling, is removing some of those legislative barriers so parents have more choice. The Overton window has shifted significantly.
Anything to add, Yuval?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and it's enormously important. I mean, education really hits closer to home than just about any other policy issue. And in my home state of Maryland, we've been engaged in a heated debate about opening schools here for months now. And it really shows you the importance of having these arguments at a level that is close to the family and close to the community. I always think of the famous story, which I thought was apocryphal, but you can actually find a video of it on C-SPAN's website, of Phil Graham in the 1980s at a congressional hearing, facing somebody from the Department of Education, the federal Department of Education, who said to him, "I care about your kids as much as you do." And Graham says, "Oh yeah, well, what are their names?" That kind of caring for your children can only really happen at the interpersonal level, and that's why decisions have to happen as close to the school board and the family as humanly possible. And it's enormously important that these decisions be made at the state level and especially at the local level, and where possible at the family level, rather than being left for people in Washington to decide. The education of our children, nothing is more important than that, and nothing's more personal than that.
Yeah. And it does seem like there is a lot of room for progress there, with parents more engaged, and in some cases more enraged than they've ever been.
Yep. Yeah, it's one way that a crisis really can create an opportunity, and we should make sure to be learning lessons and make the most of them.
Yeah, I think another area where people are really concerned, and real people are feeling this every day, is jobs, right? Like, what institution or person is going to help get our friends and family back to work?
Yeah, I think that's an area too where we've seen that putting too much decision-making power at the national level creates just bizarre incongruities and problems that make no sense on the ground, but that are a function of decisions being made by people who aren't on the ground. And I think the economic response, the way of coming back into a growing and strong economy in the wake of this pandemic, is again a set of decisions that are best going to be made by decision makers who can see what's happening on the ground. There's an inclination to treat economic policy as a national question, to think, what's the president going to do about this and that? That's important, but the president doesn't decide ultimately how our local economies work. That has to be decided by the people engaged in them and by the people who are committed to seeing them succeed.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to a few audience questions. In the same realm, we've already talked about education and a few other policy areas, but Ed Johnson, and Ed, welcome back to the show, wanted to know a little bit more in terms of patient-first healthcare and reduced regulations. What's the probability that a good number of states will take the lead on these issues? Tracy, what do you think?
I think there's a tremendous opportunity. When the pandemic hit almost a year ago, we had governors and state legislative leaders coming to our think tanks looking for quick ideas to vastly expand healthcare access. We had those ideas in ready format. And now the goal is to make those temporary reforms permanent in all of the states that have used those, whether that's telehealth or reforming certificate of need. People are better served, especially during the pandemic, when we can reduce these barriers.
Healthcare is the one issue where, I mean, I would say if we think about education, you can say, thankfully, it's very decentralized and we've got to keep it that way. Healthcare is an issue that is much too centralized, and we can see our way to solving problems through decentralization. We can see how states really can do this better and can find ways of thinking about financing and about regulating that just make more sense. And again, the pandemic, as Tracy says, has taught us that actually telehealth is useful to everybody. I mean, if you had told me that my parents would be using telemedicine to do their sort of basic ongoing healthcare a year ago, I would have thought you were crazy. But now everybody is, and certainly, and they are too. And we've gotten over a kind of coordination problem where now these things are within the reach of everyone. And coming out of this, we've got to think about what our healthcare system looks like now and where we can create new sorts of paths to people getting access to care that were not imaginable before. And a lot of those are decisions that are going to have to be made at the level of states and localities. In terms of what to permit, how to regulate medicine, all kinds of decisions that rightly belong to the states.
Yeah, it's a silver lining of what has been a very difficult year with the pandemic, is that we can talk about how market mechanisms can serve people in healthcare, but there's nothing like a giant demonstration project where Americans are really pushed to test out telehealth and see that, look, this is easier than I thought. Even if my mother can get online and be able to talk to her doctor, this has done a lot to really demystify these mechanisms to expand healthcare access. Now the challenge is to make them permanent.
Great. And now let's talk a little bit about vaccines. There have been a lot of different states at different paces getting shots in arms. Tracy, why is that? What's going on with that?
Laboratories of democracy at different states allowed to, I mean, Florida has been so successful that they have they're trying to stop medical tourism, right? Vaccine tourism. That speaks for itself. So this is the power of states being allowed to be able to test out what's best. And like you've all said, other states are watching and they can imitate what's working or not, and then have to answer to their citizens. Mm-hmm. I will mention there is a recall effort here in California, so I don't know.
Yvonne, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's another way that you can see real signs of life, even in states that are they're almost one-party states by this point. To actually see failure and to actually see success is the best way ultimately to judge political leadership. And there's a pattern to what's been working, and that pattern is to use existing systems, commercial systems and others, where people are good at distributing. Walmart knows how to do something like this, and the existing pharmacies know how to do this. States that have given them the power, like West Virginia, like to an extent also Florida, are just moving faster and doing better. And ultimately, you learn from reality. You can't just apply abstract principles and think that that's a way to govern.
Yeah, there was a recent Wall Street Journal piece that talked about how the states that followed the way the federal government said to vaccinate their folks, those are the ones that are behind, but the states that broke the rules and said we know a better way seem to be having success. Mm-hmm. Imagine that. Okay, next question.
Let me add just one more thing, Rebecca, is that really validates what a lot of our polling shows us, that when people are given a choice, they choose markets. Americans, by and large, are pragmatic. And so when the states get activated, and that's a lot of what this network does, we can fuel these changes. And when they spread from state to state, they start having national impact. So this just backs up what a lot of our polls are telling us.
Yeah, great point, Tracy. Another question from Mr. Manning. It's hard to end state and local government dependence on federal money. There are some proposals out there on how to do it. Do you guys see this as ever becoming a reality, or any good steps that come to mind to get us there?
It's an enormously challenging problem. There are good ideas out there, and we at National Affairs, a journal that I run, published a piece by Jim Buckley, which later became a book of his, arguing basically for eliminating grants in kind to states and trying to help the states recover from this enormous power grab of the federal government, whereby they give the states some money and then make demands about how to run programs. I've always thought that the way to begin to do that, because the politics of that and even the fiscal side of that is very, very challenging, that the way to begin is to separate authorities. For example, a deal between the states and the federal government where the federal government federalizes portions of Medicaid, but lets the states completely control education and totally steps out of education, would create clearer lines of authority so that at least it's possible for the states to know we control this and we can set policy. And yes, the money is our responsibility, but ultimately decisions are within our power too. I think by beginning from that kind of separation, because the problem right now is that everything is all mixed together and there's only a little bit of federal money in K through 12 education, but it gives the feds a huge amount of power because they can always threaten to take away that money if the states don't do what they say. And that kind of situation just isn't fair to the states and ultimately doesn't allow them to experiment in the ways that we could all learn from. So I think beginning by separating and then moving toward that kind of James Buckley idea of just not thinking about grants as one of the ways that federalism works, which is not how it was intended to work, could help us get to a place where state government really governs.
Yeah, it is a challenge. If we want the states to step up, we have to help them break these handcuffs, and in some cases, an addiction to the federal funds that they've come to rely on to meet their state budget needs. There's some really thoughtful work done by a lot of our state affiliates on this issue. It could be its own America at its Best episode, because if we can break this chain of mandates and dependency, then you'll see more states stepping up and experimenting even more.
Good. All right. Last question, Yuval. Let's zoom out for a second and look at the big picture, because it's tough when we're all in the trenches and we're just fighting what's in front of us. How does history inform where we are today and where we're headed? What can we learn?
Well, look, in a lot of ways, this is a very challenging time for the United States. It's a time when our politics seems to be paralyzed by polarization, by disagreement, by, frankly, a failure to think about the future. When you look at our national politics, so little of what gets talked about is really about what our country is going to need 20 years from now, which should be the main and primary focus of our political debates. And we're confronting a range of challenges that make it very difficult for us to be optimistic about the future. At the same time, it's exactly history that can help us to see that America has come out of far greater difficulties than this in the past, and that it's done in a particular way. It's done it by focusing on practical needs as they confront people one-on-one, in groups, in communities, in our local governments, and then in the states, and then at the national level. It's bottom up that our country works. It's not a cliche, it's a reality. And I think if we think about our challenges now that way, rather than say, well, the Democrats now control the presidency in both houses of Congress, so we're just playing defense and we're stuck till next time. If all we do now is play defense, we're not going to be ready next time. We're not going to have the ideas, we're not going to have the evidence, we're not going to have the experience to govern and show voters that we can govern. But if we use this time to try to solve problems where we are, both in those states where the people in power are like-minded, and in those states where it's just possible to work across party lines, which is a lot of places, then we'll be in a much better place to offer this country a way forward out of its troubles. And ultimately, I am hopeful about America precisely because of its capacity to regenerate itself, revitalize its institutions, and arise out of challenging times. It's not because this isn't a challenging time, it sure is, but it's because we as a nation have the capacity to handle times like this. We're being tested now, and we have to rise up and prove ourselves.
Very well said. Tracy, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I do think there is so much reason for hope that this network is especially well positioned to invigorate the people in their states and their state legislatures, and in a way try to rekindle what de Tocqueville saw, that restlessness in America at the state and local level. Especially, you see people voting with their feet, moving state to state to find a state that better fits their needs. This sends a signal. These are the laboratories of democracy, and I believe that if we can help people focus on what is working and how they have a degree of personal agency at the state and local level to govern themselves and help their state legislatures regain the consent of the governed, we can point them to these solutions. That's why we have these 65 solution centers, at least one in every state, to point people back towards ways we can empower them to have to protect their prosperity for them, for their children, for the future. So state solutions do lead to national impact, and that's what this network is all about.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Yuval. I think you guys certainly have reminded all of us in part that everything coming out of Washington, D.C. right now is very much out of touch with what actual people want or need. The best way to solve some of the biggest problems facing Americans today is to do it locally. Yuval, you mentioned that there is room right now for the states to lead. That gives me reason to be hopeful. I know that you're hopeful as well. And I'm so thankful to all of you who've come to view this show today, because you guys are the reason that we have a network, a state-based network that's strong and ready to accelerate this leadership from the states. So thank you guys for all that you do. And can't tell you how much we appreciate it. We will be in touch with our topic of our next show. If there's anything you want to see or any guests you'd like to have, please don't hesitate to let us know. And thanks for all you do. Thank you, Yuval, and thank you, Tracy.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Take care.